So what we're going to be doing with the Bhagavad-Gita is to basically go chapter by chapter and talk about some of the key ideas that are coming out of each one. Basically, every single verse in the Gita is like a nugget of meaning, and you could just basically pick any random verse you wanted and mine it for different kinds of knowledge that it contains. So there's no way to actually do an exhaustive reading of the Gita through short videos, but the basic goal that we'll have is to get a sense of what each chapter presents, to get you kind of oriented so that as you are reading through the Gita on your own, you can spend time exploring whichever verse catches your eye, but with a bigger picture already in mind. So with that, let's get started. Here's what happens in the first 6 chapters, or the Discourses, as Laurie Patton's translated it. First, in chapter 1, Arjuna has a problem, right? He has to kill his family, but he doesn't want to kill his family. He despises the idea of doing it, and he feels like it's his dharma to protect his family, not to kill them, right? He loses all his confidence in the war, and his bow slips from his hand, and he sinks down, and he just wants to quit, right? This is all chapter 1. Now in chapter 2, Krishna tries to encourage Arjuna using a number of increasingly sophisticated arguments. First is a basic argument. He appeals to Arjuna's manliness. He says, "Don't be like a eunuch, Arjuna. Stand up, fight like a man." Right? But Arjuna is not convinced by this argument. He still kind of refuses to fight. In the rest of the chapter, Krishna now provides 4 basic arguments to try to convince Arjuna to keep fighting. First, he uses the idea of the undying Atman and rebirth to argue that the warriors he's about to kill aren't really going to die. Right? They're going to be reborn. The second thing he says is that it's his dharma as a kshatriya, which is more important to maintain, because if he doesn't follow this dharma, the world will sink into chaos. Third, Krishna points out that if Arjuna has proper knowledge, meaning if he has an intellect that's under control and he acts without regard to the fruit of the action, then he'll be okay. Now finally, he's going to spend the rest of the chapter 2 explaining how a man can get this proper knowledge through meditative practices and self-control, meaning through the philosophical schools called Sankhya and Yoga, and how these paths can ultimately lead to final liberation, while ritual actions can't do that. Now, book 3 starts off with Arjuna getting kind of confused with what Krishna has just said. He says, if getting proper knowledge is better than doing blind ritual actions, then why are you ordering me to do all of these horrible actions? That's what he asks Krishna. Krishna, maybe it said a little bit too much in the last chapter, because he's kind of now forced to go deeper into these philosophical issues that were gripping early India at the time of the composition of the Gita, with our basic question that we've already asked: is it better to do rituals, or is it better to be a renunciant? Krishna explains that these are 2 different paths. One is called the path of the Sankhya philosophers, and this is known as the Jnana Marga, the path of knowledge, Jnana. In this path, knowledge and contemplation is the base for liberation, and this liberation necessarily needs to have renunciation. The other path to escape karmic bondage is something that he derives from the school of yoga philosophy, and this is a new idea in the Gita, a path that he calls the karma yoga, which means the path of disciplined action. This doesn't have to involve renunciation, we find out, and Krishna is actually positing this method as a new way to allow you to pursue liberation without leaving the social world. Now, the rest of this chapter, Krishna is going to go through very carefully describing what this new idea of karma yoga is all about. First, Krishna links this idea of karma yoga to the old Vedic ritualist idea that violent action, like killing an animal and so on, becomes a good action when it's done as a sacrifice. and not for one's own personal benefit. In other words, when it's done for a higher cosmic purpose, any action, even a violent one, will be free of karmic bondage. And so after Krishna has deconstructed the goal of an action, he then tackles the idea of an agent of an action. He says, if you think you're doing an action, you're confused, right? Actually, the true self, your Atman, is not the agent of any actions at all. Instead, it's your physical self, that chariot with its driver, which is the ego or the intellect. The rider doesn't act at all, remember? All of this Krishna explains using terms and concepts from Sankhya philosophy and also the Upanishads, including the Katha Upanishad, which he totally plagiarizes in quite a few places. Basically, after he's deconstructed both the goal of action and the agent of action, he says, this is when you can become a self-controlled individual, after you've gotten a true sense of these two different things. Then Krishna says you can keep on acting in the world without grief, and so you don't need to renounce the world in order to find peace. You'll already have achieved it. So how are you supposed to do all of this? This relinquishment, renunciation business? This is what Krishna begins to tell Arjuna in chapter 4. Chapter 4 now is going to have two different parts to it. In the first part of the discourse, Arjuna asks Krishna, hey, who are you that's telling me all of this? Who are you to know all of these things? Here now Krishna makes a claim, his first claim to his divinity, suggesting that he comes into the world to fix dharma when it's broken, and he serves as a guide to those seeking liberation. He claims he's the creator of the world. He is that Brahman, and that ultimately he's also the agent of every action. Basically, he makes a claim that he is this thing called the Godhead, the ultimate yogic destination that those who are practicing yoga are seeking to arrive at, to get to. In the second part of this chapter, he then continues his discussion of the right way that you should engage in karma, in action, without having to suffer karmic bondage, the impact, the consequences. Krishna emphasizes here the importance of acquiring wisdom, because that's going to be a key ingredient in being able to let go of the fruits of your actions. He illustrates it by going through all the different kinds of ways in which renunciants go about doing their renunciant practices: breath control, fasting, other forms of self-denial. And ultimately he says that in order to do all of these things successfully, good renunciants have to first have true knowledge. Right? Krishna then says that if you have this knowledge, this wisdom, it's like a fire that turns all of your karma, all of your actions into ashes. He then caps this all off by saying, Arjuna, look, all you have to do is to have wisdom and then keep on acting in the world in a yogic way, meaning in a way that's self-restrained, and then you'll end up just like those renunciants out there in the forest, but here in the world. Now, all of this just makes Arjuna even more confused at the start of chapter 5. Arjuna is puzzled. He says, Krishna, you just went through praising all of these renunciants, and now you also praised karma yoga, disciplined action. Which one of these is now better, renunciation or karma yoga? This chapter, chapter 5, is maybe the most crucial to understanding the kind of intellectual controversies that were going on in the background at the time of the Gita in ancient India. Krishna replies to Arjuna's question, saying which is better, by saying actually both renunciation and karma yoga are fine. Right? Both of them will lead you to moksha, liberation. But he says that karma yoga is better than renunciation because the two schools of philosophy, Sankhya and Yoga, they're really the same thing. Both are pathways to liberation. But yoga is better because you can do yoga even when you're performing your everyday actions. When you act with yoga, you have the realizations that you're not acting at all. Now, much of this chapter is then kind of a propaganda for the school of yoga, illustrating how yoga can do this. How can it help you get freed from karmic bondage, but also do all kinds of other things, transcend social difference, gain infinite joy in the world, then also achieve that thing that Buddhists were trying to do, to get nirvana, to get total cessation, ultimate peace. Now, chapter 6 of the Gita is going to provide a rich overview of what the ideal yogic practitioner should be like, the ideal yogi, right? This is someone who either completely has renounced the social world and is practicing yoga to achieve liberation, or someone who follows this new path of karma yoga so that they remain in the world, right, doing their everyday jobs, but practice yoga to restrain their senses and through that relinquish the fruits of their actions. At the start of this chapter, Krishna goes into some kind of basic details about what yoga is like as a practice. It's interesting, actually. The goal of yoga practice, he explains, is to conquer the self by the self. By this, he means that your higher spiritual self should conquer your material self. This allows a yogic practitioner to always be content, no matter what's happening around them. And as Krishna says, for a perfect yogi, a lump of clay, a stone, and a piece of gold are exactly the same. So how do you do it? How do you get to this state? This is what we find out in verses 10 through 18. First, you set up a seat in a comfortable space, covered with cloth, animal skin, or grass. Then you focus your mind on a point at the tip of your nose with a firm and balanced posture and begin to control your senses, first and then your breath, then your mind. And then Krishna says the yogic practitioner should focus on me. Now, what does he mean to focus on him, on Krishna? He's going to say it a couple of times, but actually we won't find out in detail what he's talking about until the next few chapters, because he's going to be talking about the unique role of Krishna as the Godhead for yoga practice. Anyway, getting back to what the yoga does spiritually for a person, this is what we find out in the next few verses. For one, the yogi's thoughts and senses become fully under control, and he gains endless joy, truth, and confidence. There's a dissolution of bondage to pain, claims Krishna, and all purposeful desires are let go of. This is what Buddhists are trying to achieve, remember? Ultimately, he explains in verse 27, the perfected yogi reaches Brahman, the highest absolute, beyond death and decay. We then learn about some other characteristics of a yogi. He sees Krishna everywhere, and he sees everything as being part of Krishna. And this also means that the yogi sees equality everywhere, since the yogi realizes that his own self is in all beings, and all beings are in his own self. Arjuna then asks him what happens to a yogi, a practitioner, who fails to arrive at this perfected state. Krishna says, don't worry about it. It's hard for everyone to get there, of course, it's true. But look, even if you don't make it to that perfected yogic state, you're still going to be born into a pure and illustrious home. He says, no one who does good travels the hard road, he says. You'll be reborn in a better birth, and then you can try to achieve yogic perfection in your next life if you want to. That's basically what the first 6 chapters of the Gita are all about. This idea of karma yoga is central here, acting in such a way that you don't accrue karmic bondage, doing karma without the consequences of karma through the help of yoga as a form of internal self-discipline. Now, next time, we're going to turn to the next 6 chapters of the Bhagavad-Gita, where Krishna is going to start talking about a super important new concept called bhakti. So stay tuned.